Hi, let's continue with this weather app here. And so far, I have, I'm getting this data from the internet here, and we're, kind of converting it to a JSON object and then grabbing, elements out of it to show, the weather data, like the name and the temperature, right? So if we click on city here and type a name in, like, I don't know, how about London, right? We'll do that one. And then I get, London and the temperature right here, right? So there's the city name and temperature. So, our next step is to make use of this open weather map delegate to send the data once it's loaded here from the request back to the owner of our open weather map instance. Okay, let's go over how that works again. Okay, so we have a class here called ViewController. Okay, and ViewController is declared as an open weather map delegate. Okay, so that means that ViewController has to implement the methods defined in the open weather map protocol. Okay, so this open weather map protocol has one function that's declared here, and anybody that wants to be a open weather map delegate has to implement that function. Okay, so when I look here at ViewController, you can see that he's declared as, or I said he, but it's just this object is declared as a open weather map delegate, and down here I've implemented the update weather function. Okay. So the other part of this puzzle is that, in ViewController, we can call on open weather map, like in this UI alert controller, we can call, open weather map get weather for city, right? And we can pass a city name into the open weather map instance, or the open weather variable here, which is an open weather map object, right? And we can call the function from the owner of the class, but the class itself, or the object itself, can't talk to its owner. It doesn't have a reference to the owner, right? So inside open weather map, we've declared a variable called a delegate, right? So here's the delegate variable, and anybody that is any object that is, and it's set to the type here called open weather map delegate. So any object that has this open weather map delegate protocol can be, a type that will satisfy this delegate property, right? Because we declare this with the same type here. So the computer sees that, and it looks at ViewController, and it sees that it has this delegate protocol declared here. So it's like, okay, well, those two are compatible, right? Okay, so we don't get any errors. So now we need to make sure that delegate gets set to the value, right? Because this has to get a value. So when I look at ViewController here and we go to the viewDidLoad method, you can see that we're saying open weather dot delegate equals self. So self is this instance of ViewController, right? And so we're assigning that to the delegate property. Okay, and that's how we're going to work. So if our open weather map instance wants to talk to its delegate, if you've set the delegate, then we can say delegate.updateWeather. Okay, so so now we've got one more thing we need to do. Okay, we got to look at. So the computer executes each line of code one at a time, and then goes on to the next line. So let's take a look at what happens inside get weather for city. Okay, so when we start here, when we call get weather for city, we pass the name of the city as a string, and then we create a request object, which is of the HTTP task type, right, which is actually this guy over here. And then we set the response serializer to JSON response serializer, which actually is one of these guys right here. And then we say request.get. And actually, get, this function get actually goes all the way down to here. Even though it doesn't show the closing parentheses, that's sort of a, like a syntactical option in Swift. Like we don't actually have to have the closing parentheses there for this. It actually can close here, and if the last parameter is a function, then it can be outside the parentheses. So actually, you know, this guy actually ends down here, and it's like we're making one call to this function called get. Okay. So what happens is the computer, you know, it creates the new object here, sets the serializer. We call the get function, and we go all the way down to here, and then you know what? We set the city name, right? But you know, we actually don't want to set the city name, okay? Because we're gonna get the city name in here after this process is finished. And then right now we're calling delegate update weather, but actually, you know, we don't want to do that yet either because we haven't finished loading the weather, right? When we call get weather, right, the computer, you know, sets this up, and then we're putting in this success handler, which is a function. We're passing a function into the get method, right, to say, you know, when you're done getting the stuff off the internet, then execute this function, okay? And if there's an error, then execute this failure function instead. And these things take time, so the computer, like, we don't want the computer to stop here when it's processing and wait for the response for the server, because that could take forever. You know, it would make our application kind of sluggish, and it may just hold there forever if there's some problem with this, right? So the computer just skips over this, right? It's like, okay, I've set this up, and when we get a response, we'll execute this code. But for right now, we're just going to continue doing everything we do. So actually, if we executed this update weather here, you know, it would not show the right data, okay, because we haven't loaded anything yet. So let's get rid of this also. Okay. So what's going to happen here? Well, you know, we call get. We set up the success handler and the failure handler down here. And what's going to happen is, you know, it's going to wait a little while. It's going to make a request on the internet to openweathermap.org. It's going to wait for the, the data to load. It's going to load the data into, you know, our iPhone app. And then it's going to execute this function for us at a later date in the future. Okay? And then we're going to, you know, make a dictionary out of the response and then convert that dictionary into kind of a JSON object that we can easily work with here, okay? And then maybe right here, after we, you know, collect the name and the temperature, and maybe we'll also get the description and the, you know, the wind speed or the max and min temperatures and all the other data, then we want to say, you know, self.delegate update weather. Okay. Now there's one problem here. This will work without an error, but then it won't actually update the data. And the problem there is that inside this get method, the HTTP task runs the internet connection or the internet request in a different thread. Okay. So, you know, you heard your computer's multi-threaded. Well, you know, this class is actually making use of the multi-threading, right? So it sets up another thread and it does the request on that thread, and it frees up the rest of the program to go on and do other stuff. So that means when this request is finished right here, this is actually running on another thread. And so when we call this from the other thread, it's not obvious from here, but when we call it from another thread, you won't get any error, but then it won't update the rest of our app, which is running on a different thread. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to add one more little thing here, and it's not obvious, but what we're going to do is we're going to type dispatch, and what I want here is I want dispatch async. Okay, so I'm going to say dispatch async, and then it says queue. Okay, so we have to say which dispatch queue, and I think for us it's dispatch get main queue. Okay, and then this takes a block, which is a function block, right? So you know, I'll select this thing here and I'll hit return like we did earlier, and Xcode will, you know, break that block and give us the default, you know, formatting for it, right? So here it's a function that takes no parameters and returns nothing. and then in, and then after the in, this is the code that we're going to execute. So what I want to do is move this self.delegate update weather into the block right here. Okay? And there we go. So now we've got our update weather. So let's see if that works. So what we don't want to do is we want to load the data here, and I want to assign the new name of the city to self.cityname, and then I want to assign the temperature to temp. Okay? And actually, you know, I set temp here to a float, right? So if I want to assign it to temp up here, you know, like this, I want to say like, you know, self.temp equals, you know, temp. So self temp is the temp that belongs to this open weather map, and then this temp right here is the temp that we declared in the variable, you know, the let variable here, right? Okay, so I want to assign that, and I'm getting an error because it's going to say like, hey, you know, temp is a string up here, but you're trying to assign a float to it. So why don't we do this? Why don't we just change this to a float, right? So we'll make that a float, and then it's going to say like, hey, you know, you got an error here because you're trying to assign a string to a float. So why don't we just make that 0.0, and that'll be a default value for our float. Okay. And there we go. And maybe I'll just take out these print statements here for now, just to clean things up a bit. And so what's going to happen? Let's follow it through again, right? We'll give it a follow through, and then we'll test it, right? So what happens here? Back to view controller. So our view controller loads, and it gets a, you know, view did load message, right? So it loads up, and then it creates a open weather map instance here and assigns it to this variable open weather. And then the view did load function executes, and we say, okay, open weather, let's set your delegate to self. So now open weather has a reference to this class. Okay. And then our program is running and everything's ready to go. Then you click the button in the corner to open up the dialog box, which is this, you know, city button tapped function, and it creates the alert box. And then when you type in the city name and tap the OK button, this OK UI alert action is executed, and it collects the city name from the text field and sets the open weather. It calls on the open weather method called getWeather4City, and it passes the value from the text field, right? So that's the name of the city that you typed into the text field, and then it calls on this inside open weather, right? So we'll go back over here, and this is where we are, and your city name is now in city. So we create the request, set up the serializer, call the get method, pass the URL and the city name here, and then we set up two blocks of code that will run. The first block will run on a success, and the second block runs on a failure. So if the network request is a success, this first block of code runs, and then if it's a failure, the second block runs and prints the error. Okay? So if the request is a success, you know, we're going to format the data as a dictionary and then kind of convert it into this JSON object. And then we'll look at each one of those little elements in the JSON object and collect the data from it. And then when we're done, we're going to, you know, switch back to the main queue and execute this self.delegate.update weather. So remember, this class is open weather, and its delegate is set to view controller, right? So we'll call the update weather method in view controller, and we know that view controller has, or the delegate has, this method because that delegate is implementing the open weather map delegate protocol, and that protocol says that it must have this thing or we would see an error message. Okay, so there we go. Let's try that out. Let's actually go back to this update weather method in, you know, because when we get all the way to here, this is going to take us back to view controller, and we're going to be doing this update weather. And here we'll set the city name, and we'll set the temperature, right? So let's give it a try here. Let's test it. So I'll test my project here. I'll wait for it to load up. I got to wait for the simulator to start. And let's tap the city button and we'll type in, how about Paris this time? And I'll click OK. And there we go. So there's our Paris, and then, oh, look, the weather updated. Of course, like the weather right now, it's coming in Kelvin, so we got to convert it to Celsius or degrees, right? We'll do that in a little bit. So right now, let's talk about the rest of the data that we can get. Okay, so that should be functioning pretty good, right? And how do we get the rest of the data, right? So our data is coming in this JSON format, right? And if I look at this and compare it to what I have here, maybe I'll do it this way, right? I'll kind of put these side by side like that. Let me resize this window here, right? I can move that over. There we go, right? So, if I look at the data here, let's go back to Open Weather Map, right? You can see, imagine that JSON is this object structure here. And so if I say JSON bracket name, then if I scroll down here and I find name, it's going to give me the name of the object or the name of the city. If I say JSON bracket main, then we're going to be here. And as we saw earlier, main actually has another object inside it, right? See the square brackets there, and this is an array, and then in that array there's another object with ID, description, and whatnot, right? So here we're getting main temperature, right? So or actually I made a mistake there. So that one's main. Let's see, where's main here? Yeah, where's main? It's in there somewhere. Oh, you know what? I closed it up. There it is right there. Okay. So yeah, so it's getting a temperature here. So what if we want to get some of this other stuff? Well, let's go to weather here. Yeah, so main, my mistake there. So, JSON main gets us to here, and then in main there's an object, and it's got temperature, pressure, humidity, temp min, temp max, right? So right now I'm getting main temperature, right? So this would be main and temperature, okay? What if we want to get something else? So maybe I want to get the weather description, right? And there's a weather description here, and it's in weather. And the square brackets means that this is an array. So weather contains an array, and there's one object in that array. So it's a little different than these two. We'll use the same strategy there. We'll say if let description equal JSON bracket, and then I want to get weather, and then weather contains an array, and I want the first item in the array, so I'll put bracket 0 to get the first item in the array, and then that first item is an object, and that object has named properties, and I want the property called description. And then that description is a string. So I'll put string on the end. Okay, there we go. And now what I want to do is I want to have a variable up here that's part of my Open Weather Map class to hold that description. I'll just call it description, and then I'll set it equal to a string, okay? And it can just be an empty string right there, and then I'll say description equals description. Oh wait, these are the same name, so actually, this description belongs to the class here, and this description is just a local var or let variable inside this function here. So this first one, we'll say self. So self.description gets us to this guy, right? And description is just a local variable that's part of the scope of this if statement, right? So I'll save that. And now, we'll follow that through, right? So once we've got the description here, when we call on self.delegate update weather, then we can go to view controller, and in the update weather method, we can say description label dot text equals open weather dot description, right? So now we've got the description from open weather, and we can display it on our page. We'll give that a test. So I'll build my app, run it in the simulator, and then here's my app here, and then we'll get the weather for some other city, right? So I'll tap in there and I'll say Tokyo, and then I'll click OK, and then it loads the weather, and we find that there's light rain in Tokyo, so that's all working. So, I'll just end this video here, and then I'll leave it for you to go through the data here in the JSON and then follow this kind of pattern here to create properties for each of the properties here. And then you can create a variable here and then go back to view controller and display those in your view controller.